everyone, welcome to AJIL Explainers, a series that my co-editor-in-chief Ingrid Brunk and I are running to provide expert information and commentary on international law during Trump 2.0. This episode features Olabisi Akingumbe on the view from Africa of Tallahassee University in Nova Scotia. And he is a very valued member of the board. He is the editor of our international decisions section, for which we are extremely grateful. And BC, thank you for being here today to speak with us about the view from Africa. So please just take it away. Tell us a little bit about what is happening in the relationship between the United States and the enormous continent of Africa at the current moment.
First, thank you to you both, Ingrid and Monica, for your work as co-editors in chief of the American Journal of International Law, and the opportunity both to contribute to this CPUS special issue around which earlier webinars and upcoming webinars are built to discuss those contributions. My thanks also goes to the CPUS section editor, Jacob Kogan. Now, without assuming much of the knowledge of our audience, or indeed those who may listen to this video after now, I will set out the wider and more recent context for how we should think about the evolving character of the Trump administration's engagement and Trump 2.0's implication for African states and its peoples. There's a deliberate emphasis on African states and its peoples because they shouldn't be, their interests should not be thought of as on the same plate. Now, for this purpose, I think it is essential to start with not Trump 2.0, but Trump 2.1 actually. Because between Trump 2.1 and 2.0 was sandwiched an era of 4 years by President Joe Biden. Now, in December 2018, President Trump, through then Ambassador John Bolton, launched its African policy under the mantra of Prosper Africa. The policy had three core areas that it focused on, which were to assist the United States companies seeking to undertake business in Africa, which is understandable. A call for African leaders to prioritize the United States over its arch rivals, in particular China and Russia, for which, if we all recall, there was a lot of issues around, trade wars then, which have come to fruition in some sense now, except it's not just with China. And their commercial, security, and political relationships, that's the US. And lastly, an enterprise that is driven by foreign aid regime. Now, while opinions will differ on the impact of the first Trump administration and its Prosper Africa campaign, my view is that the seeds of what we're experiencing today in Trump 2.0 were effectively seeded, and President Biden's intervention did not gravely impact those seeds. Now, to turn the page, or before turning the page to Trump 2.0, more generally, in the proclamation of America First policy, which was also the mantra that President Trump used in the first era, we see specifically the seeds of unilateralism, seeds of economic coercion potentials at the time, deepening asymmetrical and power-based economic relations, retreat from multilateralism. There were a lot of threats to international financial institutions and US participation in them. They were all laid bare. His second era, as we have seen, has not only, to a large extent accomplished this, but has furnished President Trump with legitimacy to bring down the sledgehammer on all these agenda items on which he has not held back at all. Therefore, unlike Trump 1.0, Trump 2.0's relations with African states have been the subject, as we discussed, of at least two clear executive orders and in action leading to the expiration, and the third one leading to the expiration of a bipartisan legislative initiative, which is the African Growth Opportunities Act. And so in our discussions, I hope we will get to some of these, if not all of them. Just to highlight at the top, the first executive order that has uh, dealt a grave impact on Africa-US relations was the one titled The Executive Order Reevaluating and Realigning United States Foreign Aid. The order itself, comprises of a series of processes leading to the eventual wind down of the U.S. AID, which we will talk about, and with that has come the end to many of the programs that were supported in Africa and globally. The second executive order, reciprocal tariffs for African countries, it has a more wider name, but for the purposes of these conversations, I'll refer to it as the reciprocal tariffs, have been deployed, in my view, as a vector not just of global, of not just of domination with African countries, but indeed of global domination, for which we will talk about them as well once we get into the details. The third one on which we'll build, I hope we'll build a conversation around, is the expiration indeed of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is a bipartisan legislative document that has been in place since year 2000 and has just wound down after it's been extended a couple of times. Now, crucially, one must not think that the implications of the current relations between second administration of President Trump and Africa is limited to these three areas. Definitely, there are more that we can touch on during the conversation. But crucially, the first 6 months, which was what the essay focused on of President Trump's second administration, has put in clear terms the disrupting effect of power politics over diplomacy, what the neglect of rules-based international order would be, and also the very damaging effects of non-empirically backed claims of unfair trade relations, especially in relationships, economic relationships that are actually characterized by a very linear and power-based relations for African states. Tariffs, as we now know, are selectively deployed as instruments of economic coaction, and with that has come a lot of backlash, both for African states and the United States. But to sort of, bring this initial opening statement to a close, Trump clearly in his 2.0 era has weaponized and globalized, the experiences of the United States. And the Trump administration has thereby, maybe inadvertently, maybe deliberately, I would argue, entrenched the experiences of most of the world and relegates them to the background by globalizing the experiences of the US. And emerging from these executive orders then is an attempt to construct our international economic order, not for the purposes of achieving just ends, but actually in service of one clear objective, which is America first. For African countries, then, the foreign aid courts, and reciprocal tariff executive orders accentuate the deeply unequal, unfair, and unjust character of, a very tough international legal regime with significant history. The impact of which is that third world domination, subordination, and acute disadvantage has been entrenched a lot. So yeah, that's my initial, opening remarks and sort of general thoughts that this short contribution sought to discuss.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And thank you also for your written contribution to the October issue of AJIL, which I encourage everyone to read the details of your argument in print. So you really helpfully started us out thinking about Trump 1.0. And I guess I have a question, since you started us there, kind of about baselines generally, right? So we're moving toward, or we're in this declared period of America first that seems to bring with it some deleterious consequences for other countries globally, including countries in Africa. But the multilateral regime that is now being replaced by unilateralism, and let's just take trade, one of your three areas. I mean, how good was the multilateral regime of trade for different parts of Africa to begin with, right? So didn't the WTO just sort of perpetuate colonial forms of domination and sort of a new post-colonial sort of neoliberal economic order. And if that's true, are we just sort of moving from bad to bad? Or are we moving from bad to worse? Are we shifting within Africa the winners and losers, that some countries will thrive more than they might have before? Anyway, you get the drift of the point, because it seems like the world was pretty unsatisfactory from an African perspective even before we got to Trump 2.0, and I'm just interested in teasing out what more specifically the impacts.
Yeah, thanks, Ingrid. Great question to start with. So I think it's important to sort of put it in clear terms in this way. The international, or what is referred to as the international economic order, was always predicated on a fraught relationship between its member states. The reality is that when that international economic order was set up, there were only a handful of what are called developed states that really were the architect of that structure. A lot of developing countries that then got independence later on, that were under colonial administration, were born into that system, and so the extent to which they really were active participants in terms of putting their own concerns on the table really has been the subject of many literature, the effect of which is that truly they were not true contributors to how the international economic order as we know it then and now has evolved. Now, with a changing climate over time, right? If you think about it, coming out of the post-war era in 1945 to when these states became independent from 1950s to 1970 and even early 80s to the really intense 1970s of the new international economic order through which the states coming out of independence sought to reorder the international economic regime through the United Nations General Assembly, goals that were frustrated, but at least they attempted to try to reorder that regime, to the growth, I won't say birth, of neoliberal economic order in the 1980s. We can chart all of that up to now and see layers of how underdevelopment, inequality, power asymmetry has been baked into the system. Now, coming up to the multilateral order itself, which is represented in the World Trade Organization, itself has not always been that. It's only just about under 40 years old. And therefore, before that, you have the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which was the way, very complex web of rules that were designed to regulate trade between states, and a lot of states that were also active were really the developed states, a handful of them as well. But at the heart of all of this was that there were hegemons, of which US was one of them, that felt their interests were protected, and therefore they didn't have any problem with the system as it was. Developing countries always had a problem with the system. They probably didn't even use that system as such, because the primary products that were the basis upon which they participated in trade had also gone back a lot as a result of how agriculture was, in my words, downgraded in the 1970s. So to come back then and sort of fast forward to the WTO era, when it was thought that coming into this moment where you have a body that sort of provides rules that member states voluntarily accede to, and which will regulate the relationships between the parties. Yes, to your question, that system was not and is not perfect, but it provided some rules, right, that provided safety net for developing countries. It had a regime of dispute settlement system, at least for a long time, that afforded the opportunity to seek remedies, or at least to put complaints out there. That system we know also has, thanks to the United States, its appellate body is not what it used to be any longer, even though the panel regime still remain. So in terms of, how good was the multilateral legal order represented by the WTO, I would say, it was doing what it's supposed to be. It had regimes that would protect, developing countries. It had, measures that were given, leeway that was given to variable ways in which the agreements were implemented that afforded them the opportunity to do that. It wasn't perfect, but the idea is that we worked within a rules-based regime. Okay. Now, coming out of that is the fact that, where we are isn't rules-based. It's actually power-based. This was what the rules-based order sought to move away from. You see, which is characterized by unilateralism, which is characterized by, if you like, friendships, countries that felt they had interests, they banded together. And so, even though at the base of the international order is some sort of inequality, the characteristics of it hasn't changed. The actors that were dominant actors are still those who are controlling the narrative today. And the future of the less developed countries has gotten worse, primarily because of the type of products that are traded upon.
Oh, good. And I'll let Monica get in. I just want to have a really quick follow-up. So when we had the WTO, the multilateral, the rules-based order that you've described, the core economic benefit of that was trade, right? I'm just trying to, and so it was a good thing that we followed the rules and we did the rule thing, not just for the sake of doing rules, but because it increased the value of trade to African countries, permitting them to develop. Is that the sort of unstated second piece?
No, actually, it is that the form of trade the African countries engaged in that enhanced their development, which is informal trade, was not recognized within the system. Right? The way in which states were created meant Nigeria, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast could trade in similar products. So there was no sort of comparative advantage if we're going the economic terms, of which Nigeria would say we are engaged in active trade with our partners. Yet they engaged more with those trades with external, with foreign countries. That entrenched the unequal relationship, right? So African states could not really participate in today's language in the global value chain of trade and the advantages it would have given to them.
So my question actually follows up really nicely on Ingrid's and your response to it, which is it's a version of the same but stated but maybe a little bit different. So if that question was really a question of like how bad was the situation before and how much better is or worse is the situation now, I guess part of my question is if we now look forward from where we are, why isn't part of the thinking or is part of the thinking, um, look, like relations between a major hegemon like the United States and any one African state are always going to be unequal and are always going to have baked within it these vestiges of the past and help to perpetuate those. And so, in some level, however painful it might be in the immediate term to disrupt those relations that existed under the WTO, on some level, having more separation between the United States and each individual African country and maybe the entire African continent is putting those countries and the continent on a better path forward and a more independent path forward.
Yeah, that's another interesting question. So I guess the way I hear it is, is bilateral agreement a sort of good way to go, right, for these countries, as opposed to existing in that framework? Uh, the short answer is no. The longer answer is, as you said, it reproduces the same type of unequal, relationship. But I don't want to focus on that because that becomes very, doesn't go too well into the heart of the issues. So let's take, for example, Kenya as a country here. At the height of what is considered Africa's most innovative regional trade agreement, which is the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which all African states have subscribed to, which seeks to create, a powerful one bloc economy, which was during Trump's first term. barely months, I'm not sure if it's up to months that that agreement was concluded and members were ratifying it, the Trump administration started negotiation of a bilateral trade agreement with Kenya, right? Now, that act in itself may seem okay, but it immediately undermines a regional goal. It immediately puts Kenya in a position where the country has to, assess whether it makes sense belonging to the community and sticking with it or thinking as a country of itself, right? So as you know, I got to towards the end of my contribution in the special issue, you would see clearly what Trump favors is bilateral trade agreements with countries. And he's been doing this a lot, but I don't think that helps developing countries at all.
But okay, good, great. Just to follow up, so if the dynamic is not U.S. A U.S. each independent African country bilateral relationship, but instead a dynamic in which the United States just has less influence, less impact, less fewer interactions with the continent as a whole and with any given African state, then is that preferable in the sense that it allows those states and the region as a whole to move toward a different model than one that was so historically and might continue to be dominated by the United States. So like for just to be more concrete, one thing that people say, for example, is that with all this disruption coming out of the United States, the United States is now, or Trump is now giving China an opportunity to provide a different kind and set of relationships with African countries than the ones that existed under the WTO or under some other form of like US determined trade system. And is that shift something that has the potential to be in the longer term desirable for the region and for these countries? Or do you think instead that the United States is sort of like never going to let the region or the specific countries out of its like iron grip, and so is always going to have its tentacles in there and be sort of like corrupting or impeding a process for a more just form of development?
Yeah. So thank you very much, Monica. That's great, follow up. And I think I'll start with the last sort of word that you put here, which is a more just, right, regime. Uh, a more just regime does not exclude the United States from being active in Africa economically. It does not also exclude China from being active in Africa, nor does it prioritize any of those interests, right? And whether in fact they are from Europe or elsewhere, or India or Brazil, even if it's South, right? So the claim is not, the argument isn't that, with less influence in Africa, we will have a better regime. No, it's a void that was actually left, which China stepped into and has maximized. And as we've seen today with the rising level of debt and debt servicing, it is consistently emerging that African countries may be in worse position for going too close to China, right? In fact, recent research output is showing in the 2023-2024 year, US investment in Africa has overtaken Chinese investment for the first time in maybe about a decade or more. So the core here is, what are the core questions here is, what should the attributes of a bilateral trade agreement whose aims are just ends to a relationship, what should they be like, right? Should for example, US corporate entities continue to lobby, right, for relaxed regime of environmental regulations in a place like Kenya, just because you want investments to come in? That won't have a just outcome. You see what I mean? So it's not so much about what the states should do in terms of the hegemons or those that are bringing in investment, since this overlaps with investment a little bit. It is about the conditions that will give birth to a just society. Now, part of that conditions is also the responsibility that are on the states themselves, right? That are recipients of whether it's the investment flows or who are supposed to create conditions for proper trading. African leaders and African elites have also been complicit in entrenching these problems. So it's not enough to point at, the hegemons alone. We must point at their interests, partners in the developing countries. And so, to come back to how I started at the beginning, I like to center the peoples here as opposed to states. Because navigating these conversations through the lens of the peoples and maybe children also puts a different, right, perspective to understanding the concerns, right? If we think about mining today, what is the long-term effect of pollution of water, desecration of land that's supposed to be meant for farming? Therefore you won't be able to have, schools and fish in the water. Well, it means a generation in the future do not have a sustainable environment to live in, right? And that really changes the lens through which we may undertake analysis than thinking in the state, concept alone. So to come back to your question, I think the claim is not for China or US or indeed any of those states to leave the country, the continent, or the country they have invested in or are trading with. It is the terms on which they are happening. But it's also about the corporate interest. Corporations, as we all know in international law today, some are more powerful than many states. So if Facebook in Nigeria, a Tesla in Nigeria negotiating with them, it's going to be problematic, right?
When we think about development aid, or let's just talk just specifically about foreign aid, because one of the things the Trump administration has done is cut a lot of aid to Africa, African countries. I think we can, we could start with the assumption that that's overall going to be bad, right? A lot of money used to flow into aid various states and peoples in Africa, and that money is not going there to do that anymore. But are there any systemic changes that come with that? So you've mentioned Kenya. If we take Kenya, so as I understand it, some of the U.S. aid in Kenya has always been related to HIV, anti-HIV drugs. That's been a big part of the aid that we were giving that we weren't giving. And at least in one possible way of thinking about it, that might provide some incentives or sort of revitalize the local Kenyan pharmaceutical industry or trade with other countries in Africa or say Brazil that produce these kinds of pharmaceuticals, and getting away from the question of like, is it bad or good? Which I'm happy to. I'm just curious, like, what changes? Are there ways we can think about how Africa will just change and be different if we posit a world in which the United States simply no longer gives any economic aid?
Okay. So another great question, and I think it's important to not be trapped, right, in the bad good narrative as well. So there are a couple of ways one can respond to that in terms of changing for Africa, right? And as I sort of also discussed in the essay, some argued, right, that this is a great opportunity for African states and African leaders to look inwards and take the baton and do what is right for their citizens, right? And I think the premise is not all African states are poor. Too often the narrative of poverty, gets traveled around and people think these countries will not survive without any kind of aid. That's not true. They can survive. It is that their leaders are also complicit in corruption, right? And so even where, they have borrowed monies from the IMF or other types of creditors who provide funds to them, there is no public monitoring of how those loans are used and the developmental goals that they claim they will be used for, right? So one piece of it is that citizens, and again, the people must, have the responsibility through legal means provided. Courts are there. They're still effective to ask questions, not just of the executive arm, but also of their representatives in the various houses of assemblies. That has not been done enough in African countries. In recent times, we've seen protests, right, on the rise against Kenya, in Tanzania, in Nigeria. They've happened, and these are ways of putting pressure on the government to do what is right, right? Only that one wishes, those were directed even more meaningfully to saying a legislator that hasn't done what they should do for the region should not be elected again, right? But that's a totally different one. So I think that's one piece, one way to imagine that. Another way to imagine, how African leaders can can work outside of the frame of this is South-South relations have been, on the table for a while now. And whether that has replicated the same type of problems, we've talked about, especially if you think about China, India, Brazil, in Africa, the reality is that they can be more intentional about thinking about the people. So again, I come back to what it means about holding government accountable, transparent administration. And while, seeking debt and, going around the world to look for that is not bad in itself, it is critical to ensure that they are used for those kind of developmental projects, whether it's health, education, social factors, infrastructure, that will enhance development for the people. Those would be ways I would think about it if we don't have any of these other funds coming from the US or indeed other parts of Europe.
Just to make the connection explicit, so the suggestion is that when a country receives aid, foreign aid for a particular purpose, that the democratic, the sort of local domestic democratic process of like taxing and spending or trying to hold governments accountable for what they do is more attenuated if we have foreign aid flowing in. So if we're not having the aid that's coming, more of the financial decision making is then more accountable, at least in democracies, through the regular political process. Is that the causal?
That is true, right? Its short-term effect may be that, we think about HIV/AIDS, multiplying a lot. We think about the effects in short term, but long term, certainly, will be that they are, constrained in continuing to rely, on foreign aid.
I just want to follow up on something that you've raised a couple times now, BC, which I think is really helpful and maybe worth exploring a little bit more, which is the point you keep making about the relationship between democratic states and their own peoples and the need for more responsiveness internally. And one of the things I've been wondering like globally, and I guess my question is to what extent or how do you think this is going to play out in Africa? But the global question I have is, after a period in which the United States put quite a bit of emphasis on anti-corruption regimes, on pro-democracy, however hypocritically, norms, on transparency in lending and in governance operations, on, again, with all the baggage that comes with it, human rights commitments tied to and associated with certain trade and lending practices. There's sort of a global reversal on all of those practices against, doing less on anti-corruption, less on democracy, less on human rights. And my question, I guess, is how you think those shifts are going to play out within Africa and might affect, in particular, the issue that you're raising, that you're highlighting for us, which is the extent to which African governments are themselves being sufficiently responsive to their own populations.
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, here I'll sort of invoke, the political scientist Francois Bayat, right, who talks about the politics of the belly in relation to African politicians. Retreating from, anti-corruption, human rights, and other kind of ideals that would otherwise protect the people, actually, puts Africans and African countries in a deeper, worrying condition. I'll step back a second, right, to sort of put some context to this, which is that it's simple, maybe simplistic, but it takes two or more people to collude to want to corrupt, right? And as we speak, a lot of the loot that's been, carved out of Africa by past and some current African leaders are in different banks in Europe and the US, right? They're not all in the Caribbean, right? As the tax haven pictures illustrate, right? And it is in fact recorded, to come back to Nigeria, one of our most corrupt past leaders has only had about 10% of what he stored in different banks in Switzerland and elsewhere return to Nigeria. So by going the way I'm going, your question did not intend to, but I just want to emphasize that we're not excusing the collusion, right, of actors in the West, right, to put it straight. But once we come back to the country, what is happening today is that, and these are not corrupt people. So again, to highlight where progressive development can happen and is happening, you do have African entrepreneurs who are not cutting away goods. These are entrepreneurs who are actually putting important development projects on the continent. So one name, which I don't know if you guys are familiar with, is Mr. Aliko Dangote, right? Who's built the biggest oil refinery on the continent easily in Lagos, Nigeria, one that has threatened to change the dynamics of how Europe, right, sells oil to other parts of the world and supplying oil actually to the US as well, right? So I think, whether it's anti-corruption, human rights, and such, African leaders, admittedly, might be mired in series of those kinds of claims right now, must take the charge to actually encourage a lot more entrepreneurs to do what some of them are already doing, right? And also not be caught in the regional, sort of economic backlash that often characterizes relationships between, for example, Nigeria and South Africa, right? Where investors suddenly are taking investments back to where they're coming from because the investment environment is not comfortable for them. So I do think, sort of put a sentence around that to close it. I do think, stopping the push does not aid African people and their desire to truly have all of these other ideals that will be useful for a good country and the socio-economic development of the citizens. But over time again, right, by highlighting key areas and key activities around which, not just African entrepreneurs, actually, now that I remember, African international financial institutions are also supporting projects. It is critical to highlight those as ways in which, as important alternatives, so to say, right, to what we have been used to before now.
I'm interested in you mentioned South to South relationships, and I'm interested in how the global geopolitical landscape is changing, and I think there's one narrative about what we could call the expanded BRIC countries, the middle powers, some of which are African, obviously. One narrative is they're sort of swinging between China and the U.S. or between the two blocs and making use of that rivalry to their own advantage. And another possibility is that we see more regional power, right? Instead of swinging between two hegemons, middle powers or developing countries could really join together and form a new bloc. And from my vantage point, we see mostly the former, but maybe a little bit of the latter. And I'm curious what the view from Africa in this larger geopolitical sense looks like. Where do you predict this is going?
Yeah, thanks, Ingrid. So, as you started asking the question, I thought there's a paragraph that I would like to read and then going to respond into it, right? Which is what, and this is not just about the US. I think it's also about Russia, particularly in Africa, China, in India as well. But with the full return of transaction, power, and conditionality-based international economic relations, African countries confront a tricky dilemma. I've argued, right? The difficulty of balancing the international trade relations and the unfettered exercise of their sovereign powers without the shadow of economic coercion. And while the geopolitical context of the Trump administration is somewhat new, yet it reveals a violent playbook of continuities of imperialism. The point I do want to actually pick on is the continuities of imperialism, right? Whether the actor is South-South or North-South, you do see those characteristics playing out fully, right? Now, my scholarship does not thrive on, and I don't thrive on pointing fingers alone at those other side because it sort of frustrates conversation that are meaningful. Here, I do think African countries have a potential, right? If only they can be forthright in their attitudes. If we think about critical raw materials, for example, now, and what that means for the current economy, they have to do more than just being providers of the basic products. That will change the game, right? But that also means you have to provide the necessary, infrastructure that allows that. Power, for example, is critical to that, right? So in terms of South-South collaborations, whether it's BRICS or all the other ones, I want to just bring out, out of brings Russia. What is Russia doing? And China as part of, a South-South collaboration, right? Especially when we center the activities of Russia in Central African states. I mean, if you think about Niger as an example, and I wrote this for a special issue on democracy and the rule of law, the sort of unrest that we have in Niger, which is characterized as, in democratic terms, isn't about democracy. It's struggle for uranium. Niger supplies 4% of what goes to Europe, right? Therefore, there's a contest between Russia and France, an erstwhile colonial power that, leaves Niger looking for who protects our interests the more, and those interests are the interests of its own oligarchs as well. So, these are the complex issues for which one can't say there's a silver bullet that addresses all the issues. But certainly, the case won't be that you cut off all kinds of economic relations. Rather, in trying to ensure that these countries, of course, capitalize to the extent that they can on gains beyond being just simple primary product supplier, then we're talking about some kind of advantages on which they can leverage, right, in their relationships between their counterparts in the global south as well. So it's, I don't know if that gets to it in a sense, but I'm being careful here of a one answer kind of narrative.
So, BC, it makes me ask the following question. It sounds a little bit, just listening to you speak and reading your essay about the situation on the continent, like we're at a little bit of a pivot point. So one can imagine moving in one possible future being that given the changes that are happening, and for example, the availability of critical minerals within the continent and the possibility of investment and growth and doing things and doing more than simply providing the raw products in the way that you're saying, that African leaders can, through various interactions with other countries outside the region and regionally, move in the direction of providing more for their peoples. Right? That's one possibility by developing more internally and having more internal investment and growth. And another possibility, it seems, is that with the influences of Russia and China and the United States, and maybe even to some extent Europe, and more general trends toward authoritarianism and away from democracy across the world, that you see a situation in which the leaders of many African countries continue to find ways to serve themselves and to serve authoritarians outside the region, and people internally and externally basically become more disenfranchised. And it seems like African leaders themselves have some role to play in deciding which way this pivot is going to go. Like both opportunities seem available because, at a moment when so much is in flux, there are opportunities as well as potential risks. And so I guess I'm just wondering how confident you are that those who are now in positions to lead in the region will sort of pivot in a direction that is sort of more rather than less conducive to providing for their peoples.
Yeah, great question, Monica. So, okay, I'll start with three sort of epithets. I can say, eternally optimistic, but I'm not so confident, right, of that future. At least for the majority of the current crop of leaders on the continent. There are exceptions. You can look at Rwanda. I believe, Mozambique. Whatever one might say of those countries, politics-wise, I think they represent some examples of what the future may look like if they continue to grow in the way they're going, right? On the other hand, you look like Tanzania, They think back to what was said about this country some years ago in terms of laws that have been put in place that are supposed to protect investors, within the country and, retool some of the more challenging situations to a favorable way for the country. The past 3, 4 years has seen a complete, descent into chaos in the last election. Not only that, the country has paid out more in settling investment arbitration claims, right, in recent times. So I think, you're right in saying this moment provides, in my language, an opportunity in some sense to recalibrate the nature of the relations between states. Will African countries take the bait and do so, or their leaders? Based on the majority of the evidence that is out there right now in terms of leaders and the appetite for authoritarian governance, I would say no. And the reason I say no is not simply because the leaders won't do so. It's because so many factors have really made it difficult for them to act, even for those who wish to act, right? If you think about a country that is paying almost 90% of what it generates to service debts, uh, with the best of intention anywhere else, there's nothing they can do, right? Other than go back to those they want to go to. But that shouldn't be a reason not to say that there isn't a way out. Do you have to borrow additional sums, right? Even as these countries are already there, a country like Nigeria is still borrowing. Against what? Right? And so I think looking to some of those countries I've mentioned, there might be hope, right? You don't go into any country, into Rwanda, right, for example, and behave in a way that isn't in line with their own recognized regimes, right? And I think, this question touches a little bit on what I would describe as, defining features of democratic administration, even as US is encountering its own pollution of its XY values around, what is considered sacrosanct values around democratic administrations. There's no globalized regime of, democracy that is sacrosanct, that can be changed. So I think part of what needs to happen might be that we need to, as some have studied in the past, something development with Chinese characteristics. We may have to think about, development with African characteristics. And that may mean some of what the US considers as its extant values are inapplicable in certain African regions just because of how the composition of society is. And I think maybe that's the type of thing that's going on in a place like Rwanda, which is trying a lot to put that. So am I confident they can change? I'm not so confident based on the current ones. Am I hopeful as an optimist that there could be? I think so, right? And I think that's where I like to keep thinking about what those might look like as a scholar.
Maybe that's a good place to wrap up. And thank you. It's just been such a pleasure to spend 45 plus minutes with you, BC. We're really grateful, as Monica said, for your work on the board and for your work on this project as well. Viewers can follow at the American Journal of International Law's website. We'll post all of the AJIL explainers along with all of the short essays upon which they are based. So we encourage you to check that out. Thank you all very much.